Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Astrid Caldas. I am a senior climate scientist for community. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Astrid Caldas. Sorry, I had an issue. I'm going to start again. My name is Astrid Caldas. Good morning. I am a senior climate scientist for community resilience at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a nonprofit that advocates for science and everyday lives of people. My work focuses on equitable and just climate adaptation and resilience measures and policies. I will be moderating this session. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, we named summers the danger seasons, when extreme heat and other climate-driven disasters, such as flood, wildfires, and hurricanes, happen and can overlap, creating compound crises that many times communities and authorities are not prepared for. 2022 is likely to be the hottest year on record, and we are already seeing extreme heat events stretching for days with record-breaking temperatures and little respite for a lot of people, particularly more vulnerable populations. BIPOC communities are particularly exposed to more extreme urban heat than white people because of low tree cover and expanses of concrete, causing the urban heat island effect. So in this session, panelists will discuss how decades of racist and discriminatory practices and development inequities, including redlining, have left neighborhoods of color and low-income communities more vulnerable to heat and rising temperatures. This is an environmental justice issue because a lot of these people do not have the health resources or the climate resilient infrastructure needed to deal with the extreme heat of urban heat islands. So now we are going to introduce our panelists who are going to talk all about these issues. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. A quick introduction from each of them, starting with you, Justin, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Madron. I'm the Associate Director of the Digital Scholarship Lab here at the University of Richmond, and our work focuses on presenting and making available the redlining collection.
Thank you. Christian?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christian Braneon. I'm a scientist at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. I co-lead urban research in the Climate Impacts Group. Most of our work is focused on understanding Earth systems modeling and understanding climate change impacts in agriculture, cities, as well as ecosystems. So very pleased to be here today and present some of my work using NASA data.
Great, thank you. Corbin.
Thank you. I'm C.N.E. Corbin, and I'm an assistant professor at Portland State University in the Talon School of Urban Studies and Planning. I study the relationships between society and nature and in the built environment by investigating the concept of the green city. And as an environmentalist and an urban political ecologist and environmental justice scholar, my work spans the historical arc from redlining to greenlining. And I study how historical processes of urbanization and current urban sustainable development initiatives and environmental policies influence and contribute to environmental injustices being reproduced today.
Thank you. And last but not least, Marshall.
Hello, I'm Marshall Shepard. I'm the director of the Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Georgia. And I also am former president of the American Meteorological Society, and I've done quite a bit of work at the intersection of urban climate, meteorology, and risk.
Okay, that was excellent. Thanks, guys. So we're now going to move on to the presentations from each one of our panelists. Presentations are going to be about 12 minutes each. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please put them on the comments in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on them. And if you have a specific question for a specific panelist, please indicate that. Or if you have a general question, just ask. Thank you very much. And Justin, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak with you a little bit about the history of redlining. We're going to go into some of the impacts and current impacts of redlining, as you'll hear from other panelists as well, and then talk a little bit about the health disparities that we're seeing associated with redline neighborhoods. But first, we're going to step back a little bit and talk about the history of redlining and little context about what redlining is. So back in 1933, FDR was just taking office. There was a huge financial crisis, which led to closure of hundreds of banks and a federal bank holiday. About a quarter of the workforce was unemployed at this time, and a third of the mortgaged homes were in default. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created, and they appropriated about $3 billion to bail out and rescue the housing and financial sectors. About 1 million homes were refinanced, and they created the long-term amortized mortgage schedules that we're all pretty familiar with today. But more importantly, they conducted city surveys and security maps as kind of a clearinghouse on local markets. And they're called the Redlining Maps now, or city security maps. And these maps are really important and tell us a lot about the historical and systematic racism that was going on in our cities in the 1930s. But more importantly, I think, is the area descriptions that were created from these redlining maps. But the maps were created, they're using recruited mortgage lenders, developers, and real estate appraisers for about 250 cities. This is one for Baltimore. And they created these maps that were color coded by credit worthiness and risk of neighborhood and lending risk. And so we see this variation of green to red in the cities, and that was by design. That was not by default. And these maps contributed to both American prosperity and racial inequality, and known as the popular term redlining. But back to those area descriptions. So each neighborhood and each colored square on the map has an area description with it. And there's 4 types of forms that were used to describe the neighborhood. And these are really important, right? And we'll dive into why these are so important. But it really gives you an insight into how they were grading these neighborhoods and why they were grading these neighborhoods. And they were all focused on race and ethnicity. So this is the Mapping and Equality Project, which kind of opens up the National Archives and all of the redlining and Holt maps that were created during this period. And here you can see all the cities that have redlining maps, and you can explore these. And again, those colors, right? A to D. So A being best, B being still desirable, C being definitely declining, and D being hazardous. So back to the area descriptions. So if you click in or go into any city, you can see the maps that are present. And by clicking on a neighborhood, you can get the scans or the forms that were created by the city surveyors creating these redlining maps. And these are really important and tell you why they were graded this way. So this is a neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia, D8. And the reason and clarifying remarks of why it was graded a D is that Negroes crowded out of D1 are crowding white men out of the aged and obsolete structures of D8. Right. So they are very race driven of why they were graded a certain particular way. Another reason that these are important is that they give insight into the physical and the makeup of the neighborhoods at the time. So we found that in 13 neighborhoods or 13 different cities across the U.S., the favorable influences were mentioned as having shaded trees or shade trees. And this is important when we're thinking about the urban heat islands effects and the warming of our cities and our planet. And even back in the 1930s, they were recognizing these as favorable influences and something that people wanted, right? And making a neighborhood nice. So we're looking at an area here in Brooklyn, New York, and we can see that this is the B neighborhood, and that one of the favorable influences, among other things, as beaches and playgrounds and tennis courts, is that shaded trees and well-kept gardens are mentioned. So we see that most of the time in A and B neighborhoods, they're talking about things like trees, they're talking about parks, they're talking about gardens, right? Versus in D areas or redlined areas, right, we don't see mentions of these physical forms. Usually they're just flat or they're paved or some other form of non-greenery, if you will. And we can see that most of these neighborhoods are either one, African American, or two, foreign born, right? In this case, Jewish and Italian populations are making up the bulk of this neighborhood here, right? And we see things about rent strikes, that the houses are in disrepair, or that they're in close proximity to industry, right? Such as dumps, factories, and this leads into to health disparities as well. So I'm going to quickly go through a couple of examples very quickly about connections to redlining and environmental injustices. And words are really important, right? And they really give us insight into how the cities were made and how class was distributed and race was distributed across cities. But we see most in A neighborhoods, right? Words like golf clubs and wooded are coming up, even in B neighborhoods, shaded trees. In C and D, we start getting things like dump, lowland, and paved. And in D neighborhoods, we see sewers, odors, and treeless when describing these types of neighborhoods. And so we're going to go through 4 examples really quick: St. Louis, Missouri, Montgomery, Alabama, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Oakland, California. And we see in St. Louis, we see the connections from warmest to the coolest parts of the city. If this will load here. Well, we'll move on. But what we see is that the highest amounts of impervious surface are located in the city core, where most of the D neighborhoods are concentrated. We see the same in Montgomery, Alabama. We see that a lot of the forest or a lot of the tree canopy cover is concentrated in areas of A and B neighborhoods. And so by using aerial imagery, we can start creating kind of a color palette, if you will, for these neighborhoods. And we see that in A neighborhoods, we have a greener color palette. In D neighborhoods and C neighborhoods, we oftentimes get, more colors like in the grays and browns, indicating impervious surface, creating, higher temperatures. And so this is a good example of an A and D neighborhood, and looking at the color palettes. And here we see looking at the heights of trees using LiDAR, that in A neighborhoods, we have higher kind of mature trees creating larger canopy covers. And in D neighborhoods, right, less, more surface. And you can see a rundown on the left is A, on the B is a D neighborhood. Pretty stark differences between canopy cover and impervious surface. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, again, a lot of the same. We're seeing a lot more impervious surface. And let me reload this real quick if this will work. So I'd like to see these maps. Right, so we see here more impervious surfaces, the darker areas, right? And we see the redlining polygons laid underneath there, right? And we see that A neighborhoods, less impervious surface, C and D neighborhoods, more impervious surface. And we can see the swipe here, compare those. And then looking at Oakland, right, comparing topography. So we've looked at tree canopy cover, impervious surface. Now looking at topography, it's very much separated by topography in Oakland, near the bay. Near the water, right, we see really kind of stark differences in vertical terrain between Oakland and the affluent kind of hill communities and lower flatland D and C neighborhoods. And we see when we're mentioning the A neighborhoods up on the hills, we're seeing groves, good views, and in the D neighborhoods, right, we're not getting any of that. We're talking about odors and we're talking about ethnicity and race.
2 minutes, Justin.
Yes, thank you. And so here you can see really the stark differences between those two. And so why does all this matter? Well, this matters because this plays into perpetuating policies, health disparities into the future that we're seeing today. And here is that same Brooklyn map, and we're looking at how it compares today. And we see that in that B neighborhood that has shaded trees, we have lower social vulnerability. We have higher life expectancy than say, D neighborhoods that were great that we see today, which have high social vulnerability and lower life expectancies than we see in A and B neighborhoods. So really kind of bringing this all back together is there's still a huge connection between redlining and current environments that we see in our urban cities today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. We're now going to hear from Christian.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all for joining me today. I'm extremely pleased to share some of my work in New York City with you all. New York is similar to other cities in the US where extreme heat is really the silent killer that kills more folks than any other weather-related disaster. And what I'm showing you now is actually land surface temperature across all the boroughs of New York City. And as Justin alluded to, you can kind of see that surface temperature, the surface on the ground actually varies quite a bit in space, right? And you can see Central Park kind of in the middle towards the north portion of the map. You can see that blue rectangle in the middle of Manhattan, and that's where you have green space. You have lots of trees. You even have a pond and water bodies there, and you see that's cooler in blue. And then you see pockets of red where you have concentrations of heat due to the urban heat island effect. And to give more context, that urban heat island effect has to do with concentrations of built materials like asphalt and concrete and pavement that absorb radiation from the sun during the day and are constantly radiating that radiation all the time. And so even though we think a lot about air temperature is really driving our health outcomes, we should note that really the human experience is also influenced by radiation coming from surfaces, the radiation coming from concrete, from walls. You probably noticed this whenever you stood on a blacktop, for example. You could feel the heat radiating from the ground. And so the distribution of land surface temperature really does affect our experience. And as Justin alluded to, past policies certainly have influenced the distribution of built materials and trees and vegetation, so that some folks are experiencing much hotter surface temperatures and air temperatures than others. In New York, those tend to be Black and brown communities. Those tend to be low-income communities. And notably, Black and brown folks are much more likely to be hospitalized or die as a result of extreme heat conditions than other demographics in New York City. And this is a trend we see across the United States. You can go to the next slide. So this is just a little more context about the urban heat island, and I think others may dig into this more. I really just want to point out that here that air temperature is distinct from surface temperature, but we do see these trends where places where there's vegetation, places where there's water bodies tend to be cooler, but we see different patterns in the morning as opposed to at night. So air temperature and surface temperature are correlated. They have some common drivers, and yet they're distinct and different. And what I'm showing you today is surface temperature. You can go to the next slide. So this is kind of a zooming in on that first image I showed you. That first image and this image uses NASA satellite data. So we're actually using satellites to get a sense for what's happening on the ground. And this satellite image is just from one day. in the summer of 2018, late morning. But I want to point out is that we can actually zoom in to a 30-meter resolution and get a sense for where we have hotspots throughout a city. This image was produced in part by an effort that I'm part of called the Urban Design Climate Workshop Series, where we bring together the private sector and academia, as well as the public sector, to better understand our urban heat island and how can we have design interventions that reduce extreme heat for vulnerable populations. And so this was part of this collaborative exercise to better understand where there was extreme heat in Sunnyside Yard, community of Queens, and think through what could we do in terms of equitable design to alleviate the extreme heat challenges there. Go to the next slide. So I want to show here some new results, and these are preliminary results, but I wanted to share them today because I think they advance this discussion around redlining and heat. I think the scientific community is typically really uncomfortable talking about how racist policies influence health outcomes, right? We've all been socialized not to talk about race and not to talk about racism, and that influences the scientific community as well, particularly the geosciences, which is overwhelmingly composed of folks that identify as white, and many folks, their parents never talk to them about race or racism. They've never talked to their children and never will talk to their children about race or racism, right? And so it's a really uncomfortable dynamic at work. So I think this work around redlining and extreme heat is extremely important. And in this work, I'm just building on the work from Jeremy Hoffman and Vivek Chandas and others who have linked extreme heat to redlining. I'm showing here a collection of land surface temperature images, or satellite images from Landsat from 4 different time periods. On the top and on the lower left, you're seeing images from Landsat 5, and then on the bottom right, you're seeing images from that are developed from Landsat 8, or box plots derived from images associated with Landsat 8. And this is land surface temperature I'm showing. And what you can see is higher land surface temperatures associated with the grades that would be considered undesirable, so grades C and D. This is consistent with the trends you see in Jeremy Hoffman's work and other folks' work. I think we've kind of advanced the work because a lot of times when you see folks do studies like this, they only use a couple images, and we use dozens of images across all these time periods to better understand the dynamic. And that's why you see a distribution of land surface temperatures. But we see statistically significant differences between the higher grades A and B, versus the lower grades C and D. If you go to the next slide. Here I'm showing normalized difference vegetation index. So this is an index that gives you a sense for the abundance of vegetation, how much tree cover you have, how much grass, how much vegetation you have on the ground. And it also gives you a sense of the health of the vegetation. But we see a similar pattern, a similar trend that complements the trend I showed before in terms of land surface temperature, right? You see less vegetation, you see a lower NDVI values at the poorer grades, or the grades that were associated with discouraging investment, and you see higher NDVI values that would be associated with more vegetation and healthier vegetation and more dense vegetation at the grades where investment was encouraged through redlining. If you go to the next slide. So here I just want to acknowledge my colleagues and collaborators. Some of this research was funded through NASA's Climate Change Research Initiative. So I'm really thankful to my colleagues at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, Dr. Gavin Smith, Dr. Ron Miller, and Matthew Pierce. And I really want to acknowledge my research team, Amel Dennis-Chuk, Alejandro Mundo, Lauren Mangla, and Alvin Shin, who helped us kind of advance this work and do quality assurance so folks can better understand the relationship between racist policies in the past and disproportionate heat burdens. Hopefully that allow us to take on anti-racist actions. So if we created racist policies that resulted in racial inequity, we could certainly create anti-racist measures and strategies that create racial equity. It's kind of just up to us. It's a decision about what we value in our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. These presentations have been, absolutely fantastic. It's just, I never tire of seeing the maps with the redlining and how they transfer to today, right? How you can see the same pattern. Next, we're going to hear from Corbin, please.
Thank you. I'm just going to see. Okay, just testing out my slides. So my work takes an urban political ecology approach, which provides an integrated and relational approach that helps untangle the interconnected economic, political, social, and ecological processes that go together to form highly uneven urban landscapes. And in doing so, I study both sides of environmental justice, the uneven distribution of environmental harms and the uneven development of environmental goods in which low-income residents and Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards while also being prevented from benefiting from environmental amenities. If I can get the next slide, please. Because this work takes a long historical view from 1937 to 2020, I was able to identify 3 eras, which I call urban political ecological eras, or UPE eras. Red, 1937 to 1968, Black, 1977 to 1999, and then green from 2005 to 2020. So I define an UPE era as a distinct period of time identified by and shaped by a bundle of policies, practices, and processes that change the relationship between people and their environment. And the new cinema laws and practices and processes reconfigure the relationships between capital, space, and people. And a new era is solidified as uniquely different than the prior. In essence, UPE eras make visible how new laws and policies or practices impact and reconfigure the spatiality of race and the materiality of space as they connect to land uses, landscapes, and the populations that reside within them. It must also be said that UPE eras are not neat, that historical turns and policy changes are neat but messy as political and ecological legacies continue to reverberate and impact future spatial, material, economic, and racial formations. And so I'm going to start with the red era and the bundle of policies and practices that come together to form the UPE era. Red includes the Homeowners Loan Corporation security grades, the Federal Housing Administration loans, and legal segregation, which produced Oakland's original suburbanization process that began in the 1930s. So the slide that you're seeing is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC map. So thank you, Justin, for laying this out. The land within the blue border indicates the municipality of Oakland, California. And this map is the visual representation of Oakland's 69 security grade area description documents. And as already said, the HOLC security grades evaluated housing tracts and assessed the investment risk of mortgages for banks and investors. And these security grades not only went from green to red, but they also had a high or low designation if the property values were considered to be better or worse than the average housing stock. So multiple factors influence the HOLC evaluation: conditions of housing stock, the types of housing stock, racial demographics, and environment, including ecology, or what we now say green amenities. So this map shows the bifurcation of Oakland into differently valued landscapes, with hills predominantly demarcated in green and blue, with the flats in yellow and red. And this map also indicates which neighborhoods and residents are worthy of investment and which are not. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll only be focusing on the green and red tracks. So Oakland has 5 green tracks, or security grade A, and they are touted as good, inspiring, or unsurpassed, with Claremont considered to be the best residential area in East Bay. And the Montclair neighborhood is recorded as a beautiful sylvan setting amongst pine and eucalyptus trees. Fine views. And the green amenities extended to the 500-acre Joaquin Miller Park, acquired by the city of Oakland in 1917, and Redwood Regional, a 1,077-acre park. From these land acquisitions, in 1934, the Regional Park District was created, aided by federal funding in the amount of $500,000, which is equivalent to about $10 million today. for the establishment of 3 CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps camps, whose workers were said to help materially bring the property to its current status as one of the finest recreation centers in America. And this is in 1942. These housing tracts were highly restricted, specifically focused on high racial restrictions. They enacted race-based restrictive covenants with protective provisions against occupancy by Negroes, Blacks, and Orientals, Asians. These grade A neighborhoods all benefited from Federal Housing Administration investments, providing low-cost, long-term loans, which were documented in the area description documents as cheaper than fair ordinary rent. These neighborhoods represent a scarce and coveted commodity in property ownership made possible through government loans and in neighborhood investments, which created access to the surrounding green amenities. The suburbanization process also granted the backyard, a privatized green space for personal enjoyment afforded by home ownership. But there are 4 security D 4th grade redlined areas in the Oakland Hills. 3 are designated as high slide risk areas and are effectively considered uninhabitable, and 1 was said to be rocked by a scandal involving several city officials and was said to have a poor reputation. And this is in stark contrast to the red line neighborhoods in the Oakland Flats. These neighborhoods are described as within walking distance of local industry for laborers, which are recorded as a favorable influence. These red tracks revealed the intersection of economic advantages through employment and environmental disadvantages amongst housing options for African Americans and Asian residents. As early as 1937, tracts in West Oakland are described as having odors from factories, as well as consisting of cheaper older homes. It's also recorded that there's odors from Bay Flats, smoke and grime from railroad shops, and local industry, noting that city taxes were too high in proportion to income and value of these homes. No green amenities or parks are acknowledged in these documents. So the Hulk upheld and solidified racially segregated housing practices, created distinct landscapes with differently valued neighborhoods, created the necessary conditions to devalue and disinvest in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian neighborhoods, homes, and land ownership, and literally cleared the way through demolition using eminent domain for urban renewal projects of the 1940s and 50s, and the creation of the Federal Freeway System and the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART system, a decade later. The legacy of the Hulk risk grades evaluation system is associated with current neighborhood racial residential patterns, poverty, income inequality, tree canopy coverage, higher ambient temperatures, and diminished home values appreciation. The Hulk data makes legible the policies and practices that created and formed the first political ecological era red, and establishes how the relationships between race, class, housing, and access to green space were formed at the beginning of the United States suburbanization process and during legal racial segregation in Oakland, California. Redlining effectively captured, contained, and contaminated these communities for generations. If I can get the next slide, please. The formation of the urban political ecology era, which I call Black, includes the 1968 Fair Housing Act ending legal race-based residential segregation, white flight, the suburbanization and outsourcing of jobs, and Prop 13, the reconfiguration of California's tax structure, which defunded public goods. This reconfigured Oakland as a chocolate city. And the term chocolate city originated in 1975 by Parliament's album, also the song called Chocolate City, which refers to geographic, demographic, and migratory shifts produced by post-World War II suburbanization that had formed a new racialized and class spatiality, a chocolate city with vanilla suburbs. A chocolate city also refers to municipalities in which positions of power, specifically the office of the mayor, are held by African American or Black leadership. And between 1968 and 1980, urban metropolitan governments began voting in their first Black mayors, including Oakland. Lionel Wilson served 3 terms in office from 1977 to 1991, followed by Elu Harris, the second Black mayor who served until 1999, after which Jerry Brown became the Oakland's first white mayor in more than 2 decades. And during this time, Robert Maynard became the first African American to own a municipal newspaper, the Oakland Tribune. In spite of these gains, African American communities in Oakland were still reeling from the loss of their homes by freeway construction. Many lived in abhorrent housing conditions that remained. The lack of industrial jobs due to suburbanization, relocation, exclusion from gainful employment, and poverty compounded by police brutality and racism created the economic, political, and social conditions which begat the Black Panther Party for self-defense.
No, Corbin.
Excuse me?
2 minutes.
Thank you. And in the 1970s, Oakland saw, and during this time, Oakland's formerly redlined neighborhoods saw a second wave of new parks, mostly associated with freeway construction. The remaining undeveloped lands from the freeway constructions were acquired and used as sites for park creation. Both new and historical parks within these neighborhoods were now situated under and near freeways. And according to the Health Effects Institute panel, the exposure zone from a highway or major road is approximately 300 to 500 meters. Similarly, the Mayo Clinic placed the highest pollution levels between 400 meters from the road and advises to avoid these kinds of areas when exercising. Out of the 26 parks in the formerly redlined neighborhoods, only 6 are outside of the exposure zone. These formerly redlined neighborhoods incurred a new set of environmental harms due to freeway construction projects of the 1950s through the 1980s. Yet the new municipal parks in formerly redlined neighborhoods did not mitigate the green space deficit between the flats and the hills. The predominantly white residents in the Oakland Hills still live in a suburban aesthetic of tree-lined streets with thick green spaces, and nestled amongst the public 500-acre Walking Miller Park, described as urban wildlands, and the 18,000-acre Redwood Regional Park, said to be peaceful groves. This is why the promise of the Green City is particularly vital for low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, which tend to be the most economically compromised and less likely to live next to or have access to healthy green spaces. If I can get the next slide, please. So this is a 2010 racial dot map from the census. And as you can see, in 2010, we still have a majority white population in the Oakland Hills, a majority Black population in West Oakland, Asian population in the Chinatown district, and East Oakland is mostly Hispanic. If I can get the next slide, please. These communities are still considered to be disadvantaged today. Next slide, please. They incur the highest pollution levels, the flats does, and they have the highest pollution because of the freeway system that entangles these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And these are where the toxic waste and hazardous waste facilities are seated, all in the flatlands of Oakland. Next slide, please. And even today, Oakland, the flats of Oakland has less parks and lower quality parks than the hills. And this is a study that was done at the Oakland Parks and Recreation Foundation. And they found that the lowest level parks are still situated in the flats of Oakland. Next slide, please. And it's from this history and the neglect of investing green spaces in the Oakland flats where you see the most vulnerable communities that are susceptible to heat island and the highest vulnerability of heat sickness because of this. So I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corbin. That was very, very good, very specific. Shepherd, let's go to you.
Okay, thank you. This is work that is a culmination of a collaboration between myself, an atmospheric scientist, Steve Holloway, an urban geographer at the University of Georgia, Jerry Shannon, a GIS expert, and several of our students. We've been looking at race, urban heat islands, and redlining in the Atlanta metropolitan area through some funding from the University of Georgia's Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion Office. Next slide. So I'm a climate scientist, and much of my research focuses on aspects of extreme weather, climate, and so forth. But an area that has emerged in my research portfolio in recent years is this idea of how climate change impacts vulnerability and marginalized populations. And so this is a framework that's often used in climate reports and climate studies that tries to situate risk as it relates to vulnerability, exposure, and hazard. So you normally will hear some discussion about vulnerability being a function of exposure, sensitivity, and the ability to bounce back, what we call the adaptive capacity and resilience. And so that has framed much of the research that I've done in recent years on that topic. Next slide. This is a paper that we recently published, really evolved from the dissertation of one of my former graduate students, Dr. Benita Casey, who's now at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And we actually tried to project out what counties in the United States will be most climate vulnerable by the year 2040 using a framework that Benita developed in her dissertation work. And again, this is a skewed vulnerability scale, so don't be fooled by all of the yellow. Those counties are still vulnerable too, but this is a highly skewed map intentionally done to show what counties are most vulnerable based on our assessment. And what you clearly see is that coastal communities, counties in the desert Southwest, and many urban counties around the US are the ones that are most climate vulnerable or at highest climate risk. Next slide. So the social context, and it looks like some of those that text got cut off, is Wilson had argued in the year 2020 that historical redlining practices had led to inequities in heat exposure in cities like Dallas, Kansas City, and so forth. And I think we've seen examples of that throughout this session today. I published a chapter in a new book called The Black Agenda that's out just this year. That chapter I wrote about the extreme weather climate gap, and you can read more about that in the chapter in The Black Agenda. And then Benita, who I just mentioned, myself and another colleague published a paper in 2015 in which we analyzed social vulnerability data, climate extremes in Georgia. And we found that urban centers had the highest climate vulnerability, not only because of the urban flooding and the urban heat, but also who's living in those communities from a social vulnerability standpoint. Next slide. The atmospheric sciences context, the combination of urban heat, heat waves, and the broader climate warming associated with climate change delivers a triple whammy for vulnerable communities living in cities. And we know this, several papers have shown this. I do want to sort of emphasize, because again, I'm an urban climate scientist, just a little urban climate 101 here, and I'll be teaching my applied climate in the or climatology in the urban environment class at the University of Georgia this fall. We often hear people refer to the heat island. There are actually several different types of heat islands, and I think one of the speakers alluded to this earlier. There's actually the surface or skin temperature heat island, which is the temperature of the paved surfaces, roadways, and so forth. There's also what you may call the air temperature heat island, or what we call the canopy layer heat island. That's the air temperature heat island. Those two are very different concepts in terms of their evolution. The canopy layer or air temperature heat island actually peaks in the evening or early morning hours. The surface temperature heat island tends to be at a maximum during the daytime. The reason I emphasize that point is that from a health disparities standpoint, it's often that canopy layer heat island that we could worry about, but it's often easier to measure the skin temperature or surface heat island because we can use things like satellite data, which is what I'll be talking primarily about in this presentation. There are also a couple of other heat islands you should be aware of. There's something called the boundary layer heat island, which is essentially the heat island extending up from the surface to about 1 kilometer above the surface. And there's also something called the hydrological urban heat island, which is something that we're looking at in our group. It's a recent paper by colleagues at Yale that noted that when rain falls on these hot paved surfaces associated with the skin temperature or surface heat island, that water heats up and runs off into streams in the ecosystem. And so there are some increased vulnerabilities in some of these very communities that we're talking about. Next slide. So we set out in this research to sort of try to identify the geographical and climatological character of the Atlanta urban heat island, and then use racialized populations to understand whether there's differential exposure. It's very similar to what you've seen in aforementioned presentations in New York and elsewhere. Next slide. I don't want to bore too deeply into the methodology because we actually do have a forthcoming paper and book chapter on this, but we examined the prevalence of heat clusters in areas of Atlanta that were actively redlined during one of two periods, the historically classified highest risk periods by the 1938 HOLC redlining map of Atlanta, which I actually had on a previous slide if you noticed it, and the areas of anti-Black discrimination in mortgage lending in the 1990s. So we were sort of using these as our sort of geographical reference frames, if you will. Our study then analyzed whether Black neighborhoods were subjected to the greatest degree of historical housing discrimination. Were they also disproportionately affected by heat clusters? Again, we used land surface temperature from the MODIS instrument flying aboard NASA's Terra and Aqua spacecraft. Now, in a previous life before joining the faculty at the University of Georgia, I was a scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. So I know a little bit about satellite data. And so that's really the approach that we use. And I won't really get into the details of the agglomerative clustering method that we use. But you can see in that image there, that's one way that we can look at the surface heat island of Atlanta. And you clearly see the lighter yellowish orange. That's the heat island, the surface heat island of Atlanta manifested. But we'll look at it in a different way on the next slides. Next slide. So the top left graphic shows us the urban heat island for the entire metropolitan Atlanta area. So you can clearly see that there is a heat island. And in this case, it's the skin temperature or surface heat island. By the way, the skin temperature and surface heat island is generally and typically a clue to where the canopy or air temperature heat island is maximized. But when we sort of disaggregated these maps by who lives where based on race, white, Black, Asian, and Latinx, based on the various heat clusters and HOLC tracks, we found that in terms of the daytime surface temperatures, communities of color experience differential exposure to heat relative to white neighborhoods, and the patterns are actually similar for the nighttime temperatures. I'm only showing you daytime temperatures. Next slide. So again, this is and we heard similar analysis earlier. In general, as neighborhood grades go from A to D, the proportion of their areas falling within the warmest skin temperature clusters go up. So that's a consistent story that you've heard today. We really wanted to bore into this because there was quite a bit of, early on, a lot of sort of research out there on redlining and whether there are these certain communities are sort of disproportionately exposed. But I think, as you've seen, there are a generation of studies emerging that are more conclusively linking these sort of redlined areas to the hottest clusters. And so that was a sort of essentially what we were doing as well. So in this way, the intergrade difference in skin temperature of the 21st century are, in our estimation, a byproduct of racially discriminatory practices of the 20th century. Next slide. This is, again, the distribution of daytime heat clusters 1 through 4 for the 4 neighborhood grades, A through D, for 1937, 1990, and 2019. So if I were to distill this down for you into a sort of a bottom line, these graphics demonstrate the persistence over 8 decades of the relationship between excessive exposure to urban heat and the intersection between neighborhood race and neighborhood income. Residents of minority neighborhoods and those marked by very low income continue to suffer from exposure to heat. And this is something that has sort of permeated those several decades. Next slide.
2 minutes, Marshall.
In perfect timing, because I think this is my last slide. So I wanted to mention that we have been involved, and we meaning scholars at the University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Arizona State, and North Carolina A&T. We have proposed to the National Science Foundation and to the U.S. Department of Engineering, the Department of Energy, a concept that we call engineering cities for thermal justice. And so we are thinking about some extremely out-of-the-box engineering concepts to fundamentally change how we engineer cities to either repurpose, redistribute those sort of unjust distributions of heat. And I'm not talking about planting trees or painting pavements white. Those are pretty low-hanging fruit solutions that we certainly should implement. But we're talking about some radical approaches to how we engineer cities. And so knock on wood, and everyone say a prayer for us, or do whatever you do for love. Because if we are funded by the Department of Energy or NSF in the future, we'll begin to explore some of these capabilities. Because again, we're trying to move beyond, yes, that's happening. I think it's pretty clear that certain communities are living in the hottest parts of cities. We're thinking now about what do we do about it. Next slide. Okay, I think that's actually it. So that was just like a backup slide that I have in there. So thank you very much.
Well, now I wanted to see the adaptation and mitigation slide. So thanks to all of you. This has been very good, and this is the part where we go to Q&A. Interestingly enough, there are no questions from the audience. So I am going to give you all a little more time to talk about your personal connections with EJ. How did you get interested in working with EJ? Was it a personal experience? Was something that you saw, something that you, throughout your studies, you started noticing? Marshall mentioned something like that. So I'd like to go each one of you in turn and say, how did you start working with EJ? Is this something that you have always done, or was there a aha moment? You know, what drew you to it? And I'm going to start in the same order. I'm going to start with Justin.
Yeah, great question, Astrid. So I would say by happenstance, really. So we started working with the redlining documents about 7 years ago with some colleagues at Virginia Tech and UNC, and you know, when we released all the redlining data and the redlining maps, we didn't know if anybody would be interested. I mean, there's few studies on redlining, usually in the major cities, but nothing kind of holistically looking at the whole nation. And some of Jeremy Huffman's work, which was mentioned here, was some of the first to look at environmental justice or in environment related to redlining, which to me was like total epiphany. And so I was really kind of blown away by that work. And I think a lot of that work really sparked all of this really great research, and not only in environmental justice, but in the public health sector as well. And it's really been exciting and just, really exciting and nice to be a part of, looking at all this wonderful research and discussions that are happening around this topic.
Thanks, Justin. I'll tell the audience that on the screen now you have some QR codes for resources and more information about, was it you, Justin, or Christian's presentation?
Yeah, that was some of that was the Mapping Equality Redlining project, and some of the slides and graphics that I showed if people would like to dive into those more.
Okay, so you can use the QR codes to access those resources. Thanks. Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I started becoming interested in environmental justice when I was a freshman at Morehouse College in Atlanta. That's Dr. Martin Luther King's alma mater, and there's this rich history around civil rights and leadership. A professor there, Dr. Glenwood Ross, brought me into a research project that seeks to understand why there were no grocery stores around the Atlanta University Center, where there was about 10,000 students, and the Atlanta University Center was surrounded by public housing. And so it quickly became clear that there was certainly an economic incentive. There's certainly a reason why you would set up a grocery store there. You would definitely make profit because you have all these folks there, and yet it was clear because of the demographics of this low income community and the perception perhaps of Black people more broadly, certain grocery chains were staying away from that community, and I think our research was valuable because later on a grocery store was put in that community in Vine City of Atlanta. And then, so I started getting involved with community organizing and working with neighborhood organizations, even though I was a physics major at Morehouse College and studied civil engineering at Georgia Tech. And much to my PhD advisor's chagrin, while I was a PhD student at Georgia Tech, I kept organizing. I kept working with local communities, really inspired by what happened in New Orleans. I have a lot of family in New Orleans, and we were really just devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The only image we had of one of our indigenous ancestors that we believe was Choctaw was lost during Hurricane Katrina. But I also had elders in Atlanta, elders in the community that were being affected by flooding that was exacerbated by the combined sewer system in Atlanta, and the choices leaders make around which parts of the city receive infrastructure upgrades and which folks don't get that. So that was kind of my my motivation for exploring environmental justice. And as I started exploring climate change as a graduate student, I was always surprised that whenever we talked about climate change impacts on less wealthy countries, we would kind of use these racist terms like developing countries, without acknowledging that these low-income countries were colonized by the wealthier countries. That in fact, the reason why they're low-income countries is because of land, of extraction of resources, extraction of humans, land dispossession, right? And so this is always the elephant in the room when we talk about climate change. How do we get here? Recognizing that the Industrial Revolution, which is really the catalyst for all these greenhouse gas emissions, happens at the same time as slavery and colonization, right? So these things are happening at the same time and are building off of each other. And so that was really my interest in climate justice. And I'm just excited that I'm able to center equity and environmental and climate justice in my current work as a climate scientist.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Corbin.
Thank you. I'm a reluctant EJ scholar. I always thought that EJ was so dystopian, and I'm very interested in sci-fi, but some of it had to do with just experiencing Oakland. I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland. My backyard was Rock Creek Park. I grew up in, apartment complexes, but I always had access to green space. I could go to DC with, on the metro and go to the zoo and go to museums. Like all of these public resources were free and available to me. And then when I moved to California and seeing how hard it is to get to these green spaces and how absent these neighborhoods are of trees, and really trying to ask the question, like, what happened? Why did this happen the way that it did? And during that time, gentrification, and I think one thing that people don't understand, gentrification happens to you. You're not warned about it. You just kind of start seeing this new world constructed around you, and spaces that you were welcomed in before, you're not welcomed in anymore. And you're seeing these huge investments. And one of those huge investments that I started seeing during gentrification is this double movement of condo creation on park creation, and then finding out that these parks weren't public parks, but they were public use through private investment, which allowed for parks to be open or closed. And we see this in Chicago with Millennium Park. We started seeing it in New York with the High Line, and how these green spaces were being created not for necessarily the communities that live there. And so that started my journey, and really thinking about what does that mean for the communities that currently exist there, where their world is completely being upended around them. And for me, I like using sci-fi. And for me, looking at Oakland, it was really this really interesting combination of both utopia and dystopia, depending on your positionality within Oakland. You'll hear two stories, whether this is a wonderful place or whether you're mourning the loss of your neighborhood, of your spaces, of these communal spaces, even the ability to enjoy parks. And then we started hearing of Alex Neto in San Francisco that got murdered in his public park while eating his lunch. You know, you hear Tamir Rice being murdered in his park, being a kid. We saw this with at Lake Merritt, where police are called on two brothers barbecuing on a Sunday morning. And then we even see this with Christian Cooper in New York City. And so for me, EJ became so apparent that it couldn't be ignored. And while I wanted to look at a completely ecologically integrated green city and rooftop gardens and living walls and how beautiful that was, I started realizing that it wasn't necessarily open to everybody. And so that's where I started doubling down on EJ work and really looking at both sides of it and how it's impacting communities in Oakland and now in Portland.
Great. Good, great stories. Thank you. Marshall.
So, I still don't really consider myself an EJ scholar or climate justice scholar. I probably sort of dip my toe in it some. But, the real motivation is I grew up in a community that's likely vulnerable to extreme floods, heat, and so forth. And so I have a vested interest. I mean, I've always centered my research on weather and climate not just around sort of these theoretical concepts, but the so what factors. And so as I look and when I travel to communities in rural Cherokee County where I grew up, or in urban Atlanta where my wife grew up, I wonder, how will these people be affected? These people look like me. They are related to me in some cases. Are they aware of it? What can I do? And so that really has served as my motivation for sort of veering a little bit, dipping my toe into this area over the last 5 to 10 years or so.
Great. So we have a few questions that came in, and a bunch of them have shared the same theme. So I'm going to bunch them into one. What does your work reveal about potential solutions to undoing environmental harms caused by redlining? Any success stories? How can Marshall speak more about the revamping of cities to address the heat island? How do we get there? How do we go from here to there? All of these are related to what can be done, basically. So have at it, people.
Well, I'll say, I mean, I'll touch on the sort of engineering side, but then we can certainly touch on the policy and sort of eroding the economic gaps and all the other things that are really at the heart of some of these inequities and so forth. There's some low-hanging fruit things that we can do to cool cities immediately. I mean, in terms of, strategic vegetation, green roofing, high albedo management in cities as opposed to blacktop surfaces and so forth. Those are sort of quick and dirty solutions, but I think we have to fundamentally rethink how we engineer cities from the standpoint of design of certain technologies, or in some cases, redistribution or repurposing of heat from the hotter parts of the communities to places that can be brought with that converting that energy to usage somewhere else in the system. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking. But that's the science engineer side of me. I'm not an engineer by degree, but I'm working with engineers. But I think there are real clear questions about income gap, inequities, policy, and so forth that perhaps some of my other colleagues can speak more intelligently to.
Would like to take.
I'll jump in. I think that I've seen some really impressive work come out of the city of Chicago. They have a new initiative around investment in tree equity, where they're actually allocating funds for planting trees in neighborhoods disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change. So this model is a model I think many cities can adopt, where you prioritize your investments in communities facing environmental justice challenges. You prioritize your investments in disinvested communities. And so this is not actually very complex. It's not difficult to do. You just decide that you're going to focus on the people more likely to have poor health outcomes. And it's important to focus on low-income communities in particular, because we know that wealth is tied to health outcomes. So I would point to Mayor Lightfoot's historic investment in tree equity in Chicago as a success, and a model that cities in the US and cities worldwide can follow, where you invest, where you focus your interventions in the most vulnerable communities, instead of just maybe using an approach that we would like with equality, using a distributive equity-based approach, where you're treating neighbors differently based on their conditions and their comorbidities and the historical context.
Corbin or Justin?
I can jump in. From my research, I realized without really securing housing and really doubling down on housing policies to keep communities in their place, that any sort of greening in a neighborhood can spur gentrification. And we see this time and time again. And what I would point to is California looking at reparations for African Americans for historical injustices that compound current issues and livelihoods today, and looking at what are those investments and how are those different types of policies, housing, green space, zoning, how can they all be implemented without displacing the very communities that need it the most. And unfortunately, with the housing speculation and it's become a very difficult road. So you see a lot of people planting trees. You see these new parks being built, but the question is, for who? So for me, it's really looking at the housing policies and keeping people in place. And honestly, I'm starting to rethink the idea of green gentrification versus thinking of greening as a visual representation of investment on the urban landscape. And gentrification was already in place or modeled, with the green space being the outcome and not the initial stressor for creating gentrification. So I'm starting to reconfigure how I'm thinking about this. And I think we also need to move, as a person that worked with Parks and Rec or worked alongside them with the Oakland Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission or Commission, which I was the chair, and I'm also now with the Portland Parks Board, not thinking about the ecology of the city and thinking about the ecosystem services and how integrated ecology can actually solve a lot of these issues, versus having these sort of green oases and cement deserts, which people can profit off of. And really rethinking the investment in our urban structure. We saw this during the COVID situation, which I hate to say that we're still in. They keep on talking about parks as crucial infrastructure, yet they neglect to fund it. Yet our recreation centers are still basically the recreation centers that were built in the 1950s. And so when we're thinking about reconfiguring and thinking through what's possible, we also have to think about those social networks and how do we what are the strategies that cities need to what are the strategies that cities need to come up with to work with their community members? Because dealing with climate change, it's not just about vulnerable communities, but it's also about communities that are made vulnerable during climate change. And unfortunately, as we have learned through sci-fi, because I always have to sneak it in there, whether you're looking at 28 Days Later or The Walking Dead, the zombie stuff, they have all taught us that we're on our own and that the government is not going to come and help us. And so what are those strategies? What are those practical human social network infrastructures that need to be in place, so when we do have these climate shocks, that we can make sure that our communities survive through them? So I'll say that.
That's great. And you already in the process answered another question that was in the comments that you may have seen. So thank you for that, about how to prevent people from being pushed out when you improve the quality of life in the location. How are people able to stay put where they are with better conditions instead of being pushed out? Justin, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, just real quickly to echo a little bit what Dr. Corbin said about housing, and you said about being pushed out. I think it's important to look at, in a lot of those redline neighborhoods, they talk about rents, right? And rents are really important, and the area descriptions that talk about the having trouble getting rents or rents going down 20-30%. And we're seeing that now with rents spiking up. And I think it's important to look at who owns the properties in these cities. And ownership is important. If you don't own something, you have no power, you have no say. And there's some work being done, I think, by the Lincoln Institute of land policy, looking at who owns buildings in the city, right? Who owns these buildings? Who owns these apartment complexes? Because ultimately they're the ones that make those decisions. And I think housing is really important. So I just wanted to bring that up a little bit. Connecting the historical pieces to rents to today, right? Talking about rent prices soaring and pushing people out.
Thank you. So I'd like to bring back something along the lines of what's being in the chat. People are talking about a lot of stuff, and something that Corbin mentioned, that the government is not going to come to help us. But when about all the things that you mentioned, there is the environmental justice, of course. We have Justice 40, we have the infrastructure bill, we have now the Inflation Reduction Act, all these things that supposedly can help us with environmental justice issues on a variety of these communities. So how do you see communities and yourselves trying to work with those bills and with those legislations in order for us to take charge and not let the government push down on us what they think is right, but we need to come up with what we need, what communities need, because they know better. So any of you have a comment on how to work with legislation to kind of get the best of it?
Well, I'll jump in. And again, I'm a scientist and engineer, not an expert on legislation. Although I'm trying to learn as much as I can. When you think about initiatives like Justice 40 and other initiatives, often benefits will be described, and we need to really interrogate. I hope communities and other folks that have more expertise around policy than I will add some real teeth to what we mean by benefits, and make sure those benefits align with what the community actually thinks is valuable for them and will change their circumstances, their conditions. I am a civil engineer by training, and I will note that the construction industry is known to be extremely racist, right, in the United States. And imagine if, when this infrastructure is constructed, we created either mandates or carrots or incentives to make sure local communities actually are hired to do that construction, to install those wind turbines, to install those green roofs, to install those reflective roofs, right? I think that is probably the missing piece, is ensuring that the contractors that do the work are sometimes contractors that are women-owned companies, companies owned by people of color, staffed by people of color, staffed by women, and also making sure local communities actually get jobs in the process. And I think there's really not much teeth there, and we need to make sure that the benefits are real around job creation, recognizing a lot of these communities are facing energy burden as well, right? They're paying a disproportionate amount of their salaries for air conditioning bills.
Anyone else?
I'll say this. I think one of the policies that we need to bring back is the brick and mortar public housing. How it was originally constructed for working class folks, and do what these luxury condos are doing. Bring back sustainable, not-for-profit housing alongside park creation, and having that be in cities that tend to be expensive. That way we keep our teachers. That way we keep our firemen. That's how we keep our families in these cities. At this time, unfortunately, and I will speak to the Oakland context specifically, they have some of the strongest rent protections, and yet we've seen gentrification take off like it is, right? So we have people that are being fixed in place and unable to move, because if they move out out of their apartment, they most likely have to move out of Oakland or California because they can't find another apartment. Those apartments are eroding. They're not, they don't have the best air quality inside. Most of the apartments in Oakland don't have air conditioning. And so when we think about heat island effect, this is something that's really new to the West Coast. I'm living in Portland, and last year they said it was a fluke. This year, like almost every week, we're in like 90-degree weather, something that we weren't expecting. And so we need to reconfigure how we think about housing. We need to reconfigure how we think about housing in connection with green space. And we need those investments to come from federal government, just like how the federal government during the New Deal invested millions of dollars in green spaces, and then effectively through segregation and housing covenants kept Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities out of those housing, out of those spaces, made it impossible for them to enjoy it or recreate in it. And so we need to undo that. We need to do something the opposite of what was being done and bring in those community members through roundtables to say, what do you want out of your housing, right? What does sustainable housing look like? And what I talk to my students all the time, especially like leaning on futures and speculation and sci-fi, how do we even know we reached what an environmentally and socially just future is? How do we know that we are there? If we can't imagine it, then we can't plan for it. And so going into that sci-fi, look at Wakanda. Why couldn't Oakland be a Wakanda? Why can't that be, right? That culturally relevant green spaces and architecture, right? But when we say that, folks laugh, right? They laugh at it because the idea of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian folks living in lush, green, beautiful spaces that reflect their cultural and community wants is just something we haven't seen before. So we have to do what hasn't existed. And so, if we build it, then it will become, right?
We need a vision. Absolutely correct. Anybody else wants to comment on that? Nope.
Well, I'll just jump in real quickly. What I often tell people, in my thinking from an anti-racist perspective, if we're trying to save money on hospitalizations, if we're trying to prevent deaths, we should actually be making low-income communities greener, right? Having more vegetation than wealthier communities, right? So it's actually not complex. Again, if we're actually trying to prevent hospitalizations, improve health outcomes, it makes sense actually to make sure that we green and change lower income communities. I think Dr. Corbin makes a great point. If we're doing that for other people, though, if we're not doing that for the folks that live in those communities right now, then maybe there's some unintended consequences. We have to make sure we're not, we do investment around about greening without displacing folks, and to make sure we have those measures in place not to displace folks.
Absolutely agree. So it's a labor of love. It's a lot of work, and we gotta really, as Corbin said, we gotta have a vision so that we know where we are going instead of just doing patches here and there, right? We need really a roadmap where how are we gonna get there and where do we want to go? What's that vision? We have just 1 minute left. I would like to ask any of the panelists if they have any last minute comments. I don't think we have any specific questions anymore. How do you get around racist systems? This is a question that can take forever to answer. But I am sure that we can kind of have some resources posted later for participants around those things. Any last comments from anybody? Nope. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all the panelists. This has been a great conversation. And I particularly like the idea of the future we want, right? This is what it's all about, is the future we want and what tools we have in hand, including the legislation that, we have to work with. And as Jacoby mentioned earlier during the keynote and Jalone, we have Justice 40 and we have means to try to get those benefits to the communities that need them most. First, we got to figure out what the benefits are, and how are we going to allocate them. So thank you very much, everybody. We are at time, and I hope to see you in other sessions, and appreciate your participation, your expertise, and your time. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for the audience. Bye.